Hello, I'm Ed Griffin. The topic today is the John Birch Society. And we have with us as our special guests two men who between them both have a combined experience of about 40 years as being official spokesmen for the Society. On my left is Mr. John McManus, who is the National Director of Public Relations for the Society, operating out of the Society's headquarters in Belmont, Massachusetts. And next to him is Mr. Charles Armour, who is the Western Governor, operating out of San Marino, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. Well, you know, about 20 years ago, the John Birch Society was in the news quite a bit. Most of it not too good. I mean, it was adverse publicity. But for the last 20 years, we haven't heard very much about the Society, and some people have the impression that it's disappeared or it's become dormant. So what is the status? What's happened to the John Birch Society?
Well, our whole purpose is to reach the American people through what we consider to be a new medium of information. We started the John Birch Society because I wasn't in on the founding, but the society was founded because the American people weren't getting the information that they needed through normal sources, through the media that we know, the press, radio, television, and so forth. So the decision was to start a information agency, a John Birch Society is what it came to be, and to reach the American people through mouth-to-mouth, hand-to-hand transfer of information and so forth. Now, we're not the usual kind of organization that starts and goes down to the press and hands them a press release and says, please carry our message to the country. We didn't think that that was going to bear any fruit from the very beginning, and so we never even tried it. Now, in the early 1960s, the Society was discovered by the people who do want more government, who do like coddling communism, who do an awful lot of things that most Americans don't want at all. And the Society became smeared. And the tremendous amount of attention given to us in the early 1960s was not of our making. It certainly wasn't something we wanted, and it was all negative. All of a sudden, it began to work in our favor. It developed a lot of curiosity. People began to say, well, let's take a look at this thing. And it began very seriously to work in our favor, and then in 1965, approximately, it stopped. So
when you say it stopped,
it stopped.
The publicity.
The publicity. All of a sudden, we had, it was about 1,000 mentions a week at one point. And overnight, it was as if somebody pulled a plug, and it was no more. But the Society kept doing its business and going about its activities, and today we are probably doing more than at any other time in our history. Our members continue to reach out and affect 10 or a dozen or 100 people each member, and so we don't get the national notoriety. That doesn't mean that we're not functioning, that we're not building a solid base of understanding that will lead to saving our country.
So in other words, nothing has really changed except the publicity.
Nothing has changed except the publicity, and of course we did get a little bit of publicity in September 1983 when the new chairman of the John Birch Society, Dr. Larry McDonald, the congressman from Georgia, was aboard the Korean airliner that was shot down over the Sea of Japan. And that brought the John Birch Society back into the news.
Well, we got thousands of members as a result of that tragedy, but I think the whole issue here is that we are alive and well. Our expertise has grown considerably. The numbers of people that we're reaching through our Speakers Bureau, through the production of video cassettes, through the productions of films and film strips, the publishing of additional books, the expansion of our full-time field staff across the country has reached out and I think is responsible for a basic climate today that among the American people it is demanding some retrenchment of government, is demanding that we take a harder stance against the most diabolical threat that mankind has ever faced, the communist conspiracy. And as a result, I think we played a large part in developing those conditions.
Well, you touched on some of the programs and principles of the Society. I'd like to get to that in a minute, but perhaps for those who are not informed about the Society at all, I think a lot of people want to know what it is, and perhaps a good question to answer in that regard is, who was John Birch?
Well, John Birch was a native of Georgia. He was educated and became a Baptist missionary in China, went there prior to our involvement in World War II, was responsible for helping several of Doolittle's Tokyo Raid flyers out of China into friendly hands, He then joined General Chennault's 14th Air Force after our involvement in the war militarily as an intelligence officer, and served the better part of the war behind Japanese lines as an intelligence officer. His contribution was tremendous to our efforts in the war in the China theater. But 10 days after the war was over, while in the uniform of an Army captain, on a peaceful mission for the government of the United States, he was brutally murdered by Chinese communists. But the story of his life, his exploits, and his death was literally hidden from the American public for many years. Finally, that story was uncovered through the efforts of a couple of members of the United States Senate. And in 1956, Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, was so impressed by the story of John Birch and by what John Birch represented as the best in American manhood that he wrote a small book called The Life of John Birch. And when he organized the society, he asked those individuals that were with him if we couldn't name the organization after Captain John Birch.
I see. Well, you mentioned the name of Robert Welch. Mr. McManus, what's happened to Robert Welch? He was the founder. We don't hear much about him anymore either.
Well, Robert Welch, first of all, is one of the more unique individuals who I've ever come into contact with. A man who was born in December of 1899, and he always said that therefore he's older than the 20th century. It should listen to him. It never did to the degree he wanted. Robert Welch started the John Birch Society as a personal crusade and tried to get other people involved in just waking up the American people as to what this country is all about, the love of our own country, and then what to do about it. And he based it in part, I think, the whole thing on a realization that is scriptural. Isaiah the prophet said his people had gone into captivity for want of information, for want of knowledge, and Robert Welch agrees with that, and anybody who stops and thinks about it would. And so he formed an information agency. Well, Robert Welch is himself a former candy manufacturer. The Welch Candy Company was he and his brother. And he was a historian, a mathematician, a philosopher, a man who had a hard-headed sense and was able to put together both his principles and an organization to help to spread these to the American people. And, of course, it was he who wrote The Life of John Birch. Then he got some friends together, and he asked them if they wouldn't listen to him for a proposal he had. That proposal took him 17 hours to deliver, and it's the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. And that's still available, and what the society is and what it does, its philosophy, its tactics, its strategy, its rationale, and what it hopes for the future and everything is all in the Blue Book, which, of course, is still available. And we want people to read that. And in declining age, Robert Welch was supplanted with his, certainly, acquiescence. Dr. Larry McDonald, congressman, longtime member of the John Birch Society, became chairman, and then he was killed. And the society now is in the hands of Mr. Clifford Barker and Mr. Thomas Hill, both longtime members of the society and in good shape.
I think, Ed, one of the interesting things that we ought to consider at this point, anyway, is that in 1958, when the society was organized, the anti-communist movement was in complete disarray. There was no real solid guidance and leadership to it. And what Mr. Welch recognized in that condition was something had to be done to give the movement some kind of stability, some kind of a basic purpose to help people understand the threat that we're under. And that, of course, was the beginning of the society.
Well, what are the basic beliefs and principles of the John Birch Society?
Well, the John Birch Society believes that our constitutional republican system of government is probably the finest system of government that mankind has yet devised to govern other men. We want to restore and preserve that limited government concept which we've inherited. Secondly, we think the system of free market economics and private enterprise certainly has developed the highest standard of living that mankind has ever known for the most number of people. And we see that under direct attack today. We want to restore private enterprise and free market economics without the imposition and invasion of the legal force of government into our pursuits of happiness. Finally, we think that the United States ought to be a strong, sovereign, defensible nation. We think that is the basic and primary purpose of our government, to secure us in our person so that we can pursue our happiness. That's why we, the people, delegated these to government that authority to do so and limited it in its functions of governing the people.
Well, that sounds very, very nice theoretically, but in reality, it seems to me that so much of the emphasis of the society is directed against communism. Now, why is it that all of the emphasis, or most of it, is against communism?
Well, communism is the threat today. I just heard recently somebody talking about captive nations, and they said that there were 42 nations that were totally dominated and captive of communism. So that's a good reason to be concerned about communism, and it's not something that is waning, it continues to grow. Southeast Asia went, Central America is threatened, the Middle East is under attack, and so forth, Afghanistan. But the society, philosophically, is just as much opposed to fascism as it is to communism. We're opposed to any form of totalitarianism. Communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, all of them, as far as we're concerned, are blood brothers in a very real as well as metaphorical sense, and we're opposed to all of them.
What do you think then is the goal of the society?
The goal of the society is to bring about an era of less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. And that's very nice sounding as well. Well, what does that mean? If you're for less government, you're opposed to practically everything going on today in Washington. They want more government. Every time you turn around, you see a new program coming along. The government is going to solve everybody's problem. Every time a government solves a problem, it mucks it up. It makes it worse. If we're for less government, we're opposed to communism. If we're for more responsibility, even more than the less government angle, we're for people taking care of themselves and government staying out of their affairs.
Let's continue this very interesting conversation about the John Birch Society after this message. Our topic is the John Birch Society, and our special guests today are Mr. John McManus, and if I may call you Jack now,
you may.
Seems like we are entitled to do that, who is the National Director of Public Relations, and Mr. Charles Armour, who I hope I may call Chuck this time. Thank you, who is the Western Governor of the John Birch Society in California. And Jack, you were just talking about the proper role of government and the attitude of the society.
Well, if you have the combination of less government and more responsibility, then you find an advancing civilization. If you, on the other side of it, turn around and have big government and people all slaves of that government and no responsibilities because government is taking care of everything, you have tyranny. You have what the people suffer in the Soviet Union, in Red China, in so many countries today. And so the whole thing boils down to basic Americanism. But maybe, Chuck, you tie it down a little bit better.
Well, we the people limited government by virtue of a contract between us and our governors called the Constitution of the United States of America. We limited it to certain functions spelled out specifically, entered into a check and balance system within that contract of what each branch of government could do and how it could check against the usurpation of power on the part of another branch. The people gave the states of this union a sovereignty and a Republican form of government as a further check against. But I don't think it takes a genius today to see that those limitations are being eroded practically daily. The usurpation of power over the states, the counties, and the cities by federal government is a common practice, and they do it by a variety of means, largely through grants and aids, and that which government finances it must control. Secondly, we have seen the tremendous growth of government in terms of the bureaucracy, the rules, regulations, guidelines on the private productive sector, emanating largely out of Washington, but then followed throughout the states. There's a tremendous burden that our private enterprise has had to carry. We see the tremendous increase in taxation, where today we're average individual is paying approximately 45% of his income in direct and indirect taxes. We see today where the United States in the last 10 years has suddenly become the #2 world power in terms of military capability, we're told. This is foreign to what our own concepts of the function of our government should be in protecting us in our person from foreign or domestic aggression. So all of these things we see happening today, and we believe, fundamentally, they are not happening by accident. We believe that they are happening by design. And, of course, this differentiates, to some degree, the position of the John Birch Society as opposed to simply an anti-communist organization.
Well, Chuck, you know, a lot of people have heard so many adverse things about the society that it's very difficult to listen objectively. They sense that, well, okay, they're saying all these nice things, I agree with that, but we know that deep down underneath, these people are racist and anti-Semitic and little tinged with fascism and so forth.
Yeah.
So while we're still on the general subject of the beliefs and principles of the society, what is the society's position regarding racial prejudices and that kind of thing?
Well, in the first place, this idea that the society has been racist is totally erroneous. It was first exposed, and we got a clean bill of health from the Senate fact-finding subcommittee in the state of California legislature way back in 1963. But our detractors continue to try and bring up these issues. I think Jack puts it extremely well when he says that our Negro members, our Latino members, our Jewish members, our Oriental members would be shocked to find that the John Birch Society was racist at all. We have a conglomeration of various races and colors and creeds in the John Birch Society.
That's one aspect of the society that I always delight in, the beautiful cross-section of America that it is. People from every walk of life, every background you can possibly think of. When I'm on a show like this, a television show sometimes, how do I respond to the charge that we're anti-Semitic or racist? And I always say it bothers me. There's no truth to it, none at all. But I say it bothers even more our black and Jewish members. and it does. And of course, it takes a little more courage for some blacks and some Jewish people and so forth to join the society. Not as much now as it used to. But we do have quite a few, and we're proud of them. We don't know how many we have either.
Yet the image persists.
Oh, well, there are people who want very much to keep the American people away from the John Birch Society. And any nasty adjective that they can possibly get in the people's minds, they will, in order to keep people from listening to what we have to say. Let's get back to this proper role of government. All right. Not too many Americans have taken time to look at the Communist Manifesto. If they did, they would find in there 10 planks that Karl Marx said, if you get these established in a nation, you will convert it into a communist state. Well, all 10 of them are partially or fully in place in the United States today, and it all happened in the 20th century. And it wasn't done to us by somebody from Moscow or somebody from Peking. It was done to us by Americans telling us that they were going to take care of us. They were going to make a better life for us. So they were going to have government take over responsibilities here and there and everywhere else. The graduated income tax, plank 2. The Federal Reserve System, control of banking and currency, plank 5, and so on. So we are being converted into a communist state. But let's get back to what Chuck said. He got into the notion of conspiracy. That's what makes the John Birch Society different. So what we say simply is things happen because men want them to happen. And if that's the case, okay, let's say it that way. Let's get people aware of the fact that no amount of shrugging their shoulders and hoping for the best is going to get their freedom saved for them when somebody is determinedly designed to destroy freedom in a conspiracy that will lead to him being on the top and the rest of his slaves.
Yeah. I couldn't help but think as you were talking about Americans doing this to Americans as though that was some kind of an exception when you really think about it. The Soviet Union was taken by Russians primarily. China was taken by Chinese,
sure.
Cubans by Cubans,
the Nazis
and so
were Germans.
forth. Yes, of course.
Right.
It's the ideology and the allegiance in the heart that's really the
Well, we've been warned over and over again that America would not fall from aggression from without, that it would fall from subversion from within. And I think we're beginning to recognize the distortion in the character of our whole political system. The point of the conspiratorial view, Ed, is is tough for people to handle. We know that. It was tough for us to come to that conclusion. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of objective study. It takes a clinical analysis of the cause and effects of the conditions that exist today as to why they would happen. And so it's easier to say for any individual, oh, no conspiracy. I'd love to say that too. But even if there weren't a conspiracy, the results or the consequences of the growth of government ultimately into a totalitarian state, whether we call it the welfare state or communism or anything in between, would have the same effect on all of us. The recognition of conspiracy, however, has a definite effect on how we go about solving the problem, because no conspiracy can stand the light of day on their nefarious activity. And when their activities, their records of individuals, of programs, of groups are exposed, then we begin to get to the core of why these alien philosophies are permeating our own political system and our own way of life, and then we're better able to get rid of it, destroy it, and then return to some kind of a road back to the limitations we the people impose.
Well, you speak of conspiracy, and that is a word which conjures up different thoughts in the minds of different people.
Ghosts?
Ghosts, perhaps. As a student at the university, I remember being taught to snicker at the concept of the conspiratorial view of history.
Yeah.
And since then, of course, I've learned that history was basically a series of major and minor conspiracies. But what do you mean? And when you use the word conspiracy today in the 20th century, what do you mean by that?
What we mean is that there is a plan, there are people part of a plan that will lead to total world domination with them on top and the rest of the people in the world as slaves. Most of the work of the conspiracy, however, is done not by the people who are in on the plan, but by people who, for any reason whatsoever, find it advantageous to do the work of the conspiracy.
Well, who are the planners?
Well, in our own country, we would focus attention on organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. These two organizations, both run by David Rockefeller out of New York City, private organizations, a membership by invitation only. They both have as a goal, although it's not explicit, it takes a little study to understand that this is indeed their goal, a socialistic one-world system, with them running it. Now, that's the same goal as communism. And then when you
Except it'd be different people running it,
That's
supposedly.
right. Well, and then when you look back into it even more so, you get to the fact that communism itself is a tool of an overall conspiracy that involves Europeans and Americans and so forth.
So we're talking about different levels.
Well, we're talking about level. We're into
branches.
something fairly heavy here. But let's bring it down to very basic. The United States government has, for 60-odd years, financed the Soviet Union, beginning in 1917, right up through today. If the United States government would stop helping communism, we've built them into a world power, we continue to supply them, and we've now given them the equipment and the technology for nuclear weapons. All the time, the leaders of our country telling us that we've got to be anti-communists, so we've got to give them more power to fight communism, but at the same time, the United States is helping communism. And what we've done for Soviet Union, we are now embarking on doing the same program for Red China. And if it doesn't say conspiracy to people when they begin to piece it all together, I don't know what other explanation it could be.
Well, what evidence, hardcore evidence, do you have of the existence of this conscious conspiracy?
The effects are the biggest evidence. There are some people who will never decide that there's a conspiracy until they see a membership card or attend a meeting or something like that. But there have been people within it who've come out and said, yes, exactly as the John Birch Society is saying, we agree. One famous fellow was this Carroll Quigley, wrote this tremendous 1,400-page book called Tragedy and Hope, and he said that he was privileged for several years to examine its papers and secret records. He called it a network, and he wasn't condemning it, he was praising it, and he wanted it to be more known. He was talking about the Council on Foreign Relations. The Trilateral Commission didn't exist at the time, but he was talking about that, and he was corroborating in great detail what we had been saying, and here he was from at least a level close to the inside of the very same conspiracy.
Well, who are these people on the Council on Foreign Relations?
They're the people who run our government. I mentioned David Rockefeller. Well, now, when you find that 5 or 6 cabinet members of each of the past 6 or 8 administrations in Washington have all been members of the Council on Foreign Relations, that the presidents themselves have come out of the organization, some of them, not all, that the press, the military, the academic world, the business world, a Council on Foreign Relations with 2,400 members out of New York City is a who's who in America. That's what it really is. And then the Trilateral Commission came along in 1973, and the Trilateral Commission is only about 80 or 90 Americans, people from Western Europe, Japan, and North America, and they have the same goal. You find 19 members of the Carter administration from the Council on Foreign from the Trilateral Commission. You find several more from the Reagan administration from this same Trilateral Commission, and it's just something that the American people should want to know.
Then we carry this one step further, and we begin to see through the very definitive research that's been done on the subject of Western assistance to the Soviet Union, in particular, and the satellite states as well. We begin to see that their whole existence today has been the result of assistance from the West and primarily from the United States of America. In other words, we have developed through our assistance and our aid and trade and gifts and what have you, the other superpower in the world today. Now all we hear about is maintaining that balance. Nobody asks how the Soviet Union got to be a superpower, as to why they were able to develop this kind of strength. They simply we're in a position today where the so-called experts in the field want to maintain the balance between the USA and the USSR as a means for world peace.
We'll come back to that point in just a minute, Chuck, if we may,
Right.
after this message. Our topic is the John Birch Society, and we have with us today 2 special guests, Mr. Jack McManus, who is the National Director of Public Relations, and Mr. Chuck Armour, who is the Western Governor operating out of Los Angeles for the 13 Western states. And Chuck, you were just talking about the balance of power and the society's position on that issue.
Well, it appears that that is the major plank in the foreign policy of the United States, and it has been for a period of years. The idea is that if we maintain the balance between us and the Soviet Union, neither one of the superpowers would dare a first strike because the other could retaliate and destroy them too. This is the mutual assured destruction philosophy of our Defense Department and of the State Department itself. It's hard to unravel and hard to explain, but nevertheless, they admit that this is kind of thing. Secondly, we have assured the Soviet Union over the years that they could stabilize their own controlled states. All of the Eastern European bloc countries have had the seeds of revolution to overthrow their communist bosses over the years. From the Solidarity movement in Poland back to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Yet the United States has had a hands-off policy, basically, and assured the Soviets that we even look with disfavor on countries on the border of the Soviet Union in discord with the Soviet Union. We sent such a telegram to Tito to that effect. Third, we are now building up the other area of the world, as Jack pointed out a moment ago, in terms of our expanded trade and diplomatic recognition and most favored nation status that we've given Red China. And ultimately, if we continue that, Red China will come into the 20th century. It has to come to us to achieve it. They will be the dominant force in all of Asia. And then we see also a redistribution of the wealth of the world from the have-nots to the haves, not by investment, not by a charitable effort. And of course, the American people have given away more of their hard-earned money and their wealth voluntarily over the years, but we now see a government that since 1945 has given away $286.5 billion of our money in foreign aid, yet we see the Soviet moving in a domination track all over the world today. We see the mechanisms set up from the IMF to the World Bank to the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and a variety of other organizations that are merely forceful ways, not voluntary ways, forceful ways of redistributing the wealth of this world from the have to the have-nots.
So you're saying that all of this couldn't be by accident?
I can't conceive how it could be so consistent by accident, Ed.
Remember James Forrestal's famous remark? Secretary of Defense in the late 40s. He said, if the diplomats who have handled and mishandled our relations with the Soviet Union were merely making mistakes, they would have occasionally made a few in our favor. Down to some specifics. The Soviet missile program today is guided by computers from the United States. The Soviet missiles are capable of multiple warheads. It's called MIRVing, sophisticated miniaturization capability that's needed for that, with ball bearings and microchips. Silicon transistor type technology came from the United States. The money to pay for many of these things was loaned to the Soviet Union by American banks, guaranteed by the United States government. The United States government picked up the tab. We built an entire truck factory for the Soviet Union at a place called the Kama River in the heart of the Soviet Union. It took about all through the 1970s to build this thing, financed with the taxpayers' money from the United States. All of you people who are watching this helped to pay for building that truck factory in the Soviet Union. And the first trucks that came off it were used to invade Afghanistan. Now, this isn't generally known. And keep in mind that this is why there is a John Birch Society, and this is also why people don't want the American people to listen to the John Birch Society.
Well, that brings up the point then, how on earth does the society, a small group of Americans, intend to change all this? And the first question that comes to mind is, well, what does a member actually do?
Wake the town and tell the people with solid, absolutely certain information that stimulates people to action. And the whole program, the whole strategy of the society, I like to say it, is majestically simple. If the American people become better informed, they will choose better leaders. At the congressional level, senators, presidents, whatever, even local, they will choose better leaders if they have the information that will stimulate them to look for a better leader.
Well, how does a member go about waking the town and telling the people?
Well, we are a pre-political organization. We do not support political candidates, raise money for them, or political parties. We educate on political issues. We look at the records of those people that represent us in government, not just the rhetoric that they give to their constituencies. Our effort, as Jack pointed out, is simply education. We are an educational organization at the grassroots. We recognize and that the American people will do the right thing if they have the truth in hand, if they're able to make the proper choices. So if they understand the basic concepts in which the American system was built, if they understand these other concepts that we've been talking today, and they understand the threat of communism around the world today, then they will make those choices. They will do the right thing, and they will manifest that understanding in intelligent and responsible political action, using our privilege of voting at the polls to express themselves. Secondly, they will use that understanding as a means to influence the Congress of the United States primarily, although we do get into some local issues, not as a national body, but we certainly encourage our members to become good citizens and involve themselves in local affairs. But that will be manifested in the influence that they can create, because politicians respond to the so-called will of the people, because most of the principles involved in politics is to get elected and re-elected. So we are at that level of building, step by step, a better understanding among the American people. We think that that is here to stay, that the John Birch Society is designed to go on for hundreds of years, not necessarily as a watchdog of our government, but more important, to help the people understand the proper role of government and all of these other concepts, the threat to their own individual liberty and freedom, and exercise the responsibility for maintaining our limited government
Well,
system.
still, what does a member actually do to accomplish these objectives?
A member fills himself with information. He gets himself informed, and then he goes and informs others. And he does it in an organized way. One of the things that the society does is it tells people the most important issues. It gives them information and background about the United Nations that we think we should get out of, about this aid and trade business to the communists, about what inflation really is and who's behind it. And of course, it's all government and the agency they created, and so on. With this perspective, then, they're better equipped. So then they go around the community and they sit down with a friend and say, give me a little time, will you? I got something important to tell you. So what do we do in the society? We produce films and books and tapes and video programs, and we have a speakers bureau, and we even have a summer camp for young people. We take them away for a week, and we give them that course we call Americanism 101.
101.
101, right. And we're bold enough to say that we can undo 4 years of college education in a single week.
There are some people who would be shocked at that.
Let me make
Some of the students that attend are shocked at that.
Right. Let me make a commercial, and then we'll do this again, too. One of the things we'd like to have developed from this program is more people get interested in what we have to say. We can't possibly cover everything, certainly. But we do offer a packet of information for interested people, and we ask you to send $2. $1 for the information, and far more than a dollar's worth, and another $1 for postage and handling. And it also tells us you really want the information. So if you would be interested to look more into what we're saying and doing, we'll give you some position papers, what is the John Birch Society, pamphlets, and so forth. Just simply write to the John Birch Society, Belmont, Massachusetts, 02178. Enclose your check for $2, ask for the packet that you saw advertised on television, and you'll be glad you have it. And then what you do with it is up to you.
Well, okay, you've mentioned the $2. Now, obviously, the society is going to become fabulously wealthy on all of these $2 checks coming in. Seriously, it raises the question, how is an organization like this financed?
It's financed through the dues and contributions of the members of the society, largely. And then through other sources of revenue, such as the sale of our books. We're not going to make any money on that packet, by the way. We're going to lose money on that.
You ought to raise the price to $12.
Well, no, I won't do that. No, $2 will do it. Then there are other ways of raising funds, but it's mostly voluntary contributions. And we don't have the tax-exempt status that most people expect that we do. We're not favored by government. We never asked for it, by the way. We didn't ask for it because we figured that at one point in time it could be taken away from us and hurt us badly. And so the dues and the contributions of the members, the sale of literature and other materials, advertising revenue in the magazines that we have helps the magazines to keep alive, and of course that's helpful. But it's tough to raise money.
Well, how do you answer the allegation that the society is financed by big money interests, the big corporate interests that have...
We wish it were so.
And it simply isn't true.
I'd like to get back to something you were talking about before. You were speaking about the fact that the society is not a political organization. And the question, I think it's a legitimate question to be amplified upon, is how does the society expect to bring about political change if they don't become involved in politics?
Well, we encourage that our individual members do become involved as good citizens in politics, because ultimately this educational program of ours, the understanding they're able to gather from it has got to manifest itself in good political action. But the society itself is simply an educational organization. The rules and regulations that are imposed upon anyone that gets into the political arena per se and partisan politics in general are horrendous. We are not involved in that. We think people will do the right thing, as I mentioned a moment ago. So we encourage people to become involved politically. That's part of good citizenship. But become involved when they have an understanding of the conditions, the concepts of what we're working for in this country and which we've inherited.
Well, do you mean to say that the society doesn't become involved in encouraging members to support a particular candidate or to oppose a particular candidate?
We don't have to. It'd be kind of a put-down for us. If somebody is really well-informed and you come to him and you say, look, I think you should vote for this fellow, he'll look at you and say, well, look, I'll make up my own mind. And our members are pretty rugged individualists, and they do. Now, if there's a conservative anti-communist running against a liberal who is thinks communism is no threat or no problem, then you'll find all the members of the society, obviously, on that. But sometimes they get themselves involved in little scrapes. But even more important than that is, does this thing work? Does this Birch Society strategy work? And the answer to that is to ask ex-Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana if it works. Ask George McGovern in South Dakota if it worked. Ask Frank Church if he were still alive. You could ask him if it works. And maybe as many as a dozen more United States senators that pointedly blamed the John Birch Society for them losing out in an election campaign because the members of the John Birch Society had educated so many of their fellow citizens about their record and about the principles involved and so forth. Same thing could be said in the Congress. Our Trim Committee putting out the records of congressmen. Do they vote for higher taxes and more government or lower taxes and less government? And millions of those Trim bulletins, keyed to the local congressmen in their areas all across the country, have led to a lot of those congressmen now being ex-congressmen. Yes, the program works, and nothing else really does.
You're saying that the educational program, then, is the only way to bring about political change?
It's the only way, I think, that it can be brought about. No amount of cutesy, smartsy tricks or political maneuvering or so forth is going to save our country. Education and awareness is going to do it, or it just isn't going to get done.
We'll return after this message. Our topic is the John Birch Society. Our special guests today are Mr. Jack McManus, who is the National Director of Public Relations, and Mr. Chuck Armour, who is the West Coast Governor of Organizational Operations, I guess you would call it. We have one more segment for this program, and I think it's time to talk about some specific problems and activities. But speaking in terms of problems, what is the biggest problem facing the John Birch Society today?
The biggest problem facing the John Birch Society is the same one facing all of civilization, and that is moral decline. More and more people don't think in terms of moral absolutes. And when people don't think in terms of moral absolutes, it's awfully hard to get them involved in a program such as ours, or even in the absolutes involved in the foundation of our nation. They've been encouraged to think in terms of much more gray than the blacks and the whites. There are things that are right, there are things that are always wrong. But the biggest problem that we see is that moral decline, and then of course it leads to an organizational problem when a lot of people will come and listen to what we have to say in a program such as this or many of the other programs that we have, will nod their head and say, well, these fellows are all right, and then walk away and do nothing about it. That's a form of moral decline. And so what we're asking people to do is to put that moral backbone in shape again. There is a right and there is a wrong. What our government is doing is wrong. Somebody got to put right back on the throne.
Well, why would a person join the society? Why couldn't he just do all the things you're talking about without becoming a member of the society?
Well, I think the basic reason that people would join the John Birch Society is, one, to get the advantage that we've accumulated over the years in the development of educational materials to educate themselves. I think that's the principle. It's the best means for an individual to become informed. Then secondly, to use those means that he enjoyed and was able to use to get himself informed, to help others inform themselves, his neighbors, his friends, his business associates, and what have you. We are all little missionaries in that sense. Third, the society enters in the picture of giving a concerted action program to stop the threat of collectivism, to change the disastrous path we're on toward totalitarianism. We can do that better through concerted action, so that people living in Florida or people living in the state of Washington or anywhere else in the country, all working on common programs that are the primary threats against individual liberty and freedom.
What are some of the aggressive programs of the society?
Well, let's take our Support Your Local Police and Keep Them Independent program, which has been quite successful for the John Birch Society. We saw the direct threat through largely communist influences in local communities to destroy the effectiveness and the morale of local law enforcement agencies, the imposition of police review boards and various other limitations imposed upon them. In the early days of the society and right up to the present, we have fought the establishment of police review boards. We brought into focus the value of local controlled law enforcement rather than a federal police force, which they would ultimately become if we allow.
These were all major programs.
These are major programs of the society. We have entered into all kinds of efforts in an educational vein to get the United States out of the United Nations. Not simply because today it is and has been over the years the principal instrumentality that the Soviets have used to achieve their objective of world conquest, but because it will ultimately serve the purpose of the so-called one world proponents of being the political framework of a world government. We have presented to the Congress, I believe, Jack, better than several million.
12 million.
12 million.
12 million petitions from the American people to get us out of the United Nations.
To get us out of the United Nations.
And at the very same time, I think one of these environmental groups was presenting a couple of 100,000, and the television programs were full of that. We called a press conference in Washington while presenting millions of signatures to Congress, and they all came, but you didn't see about it. It was pigeonholed, it got buried, and so forth.
Well, if these are some of the major programs of the society, what about some of the major accomplishments of the society?
Well, the accomplishments, we did touch on that in discussing the fact that some of these politicians are no longer in office. But the society has also successfully stopped several programs that were very, very damaging to our country that would have led to problems down the road. For instance, the promoters of the very poorly and misnamed Equal Rights Amendment, which is not for equal rights, but for bigger and more government, that's plank 2 of that program. They would tell you that when the John Birch Society got involved in stopping that amendment, that it stopped it. And if we hadn't, it would now be part of the Constitution, and it would be absolute chaos in our country in the legal sense. We stopped the American Indian movement from taking control of it.
Why is the society opposed to the ERA?
We're opposed to it because it's not for equal rights. It's primarily a vehicle for more government. The Equal Rights Amendment would allow the federal government to then take over and have all sole jurisdiction on any legislation involving men or women.
Men or women?
That's pretty big.
That's a pretty big
That's
category.
a pretty big category. Now, that's the issue. So we stopped that. We stopped the American Indian movement. We stopped...
What's wrong with the American Indian movement?
The American Indian movement, simply a plot hatched by a bunch of pro-communist criminal types for taking over a portion of the United States, having themselves recognized immediately by communist allies, Czechoslovakia and so forth, shipping in arms to wage war on the United States from within. And this was all planned and all hatched and ready to go, and the American Indian people didn't have anybody speaking for them. All of a sudden they did. They all said, well, this is good.
That was our counterpart of the Viet Cong or the...
It was a very
Sandinista
dangerous thing, and a very few courageous Americans in that part of the country where the American Indian population is high, several of them members of the John Birch Society of American Indian descent, went around and distributed a couple of 100,000 copies of information about what these fellows really were about, not what they were saying, but what they were really about, and the whole thing fizzled. Now, you know, we don't get credit for that. The American people never even considered it, most of them, as a very real threat. But mostly what we try to do is to focus on information that is being denied the American people. We like to get the story behind the scenes or raise something from page 32 to the prominence it deserves and so forth. Let me give you a good example. A couple of years ago was a great huzzah raised by the press when George Shultz was named the Secretary of State because he and the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, had both come from the Bechtel Corporation in San Francisco. And maybe there's a conflict of interest here. And it was a great big examination of the Bechtel connection, it was called. Nobody said a thing about the fact that George Shultz would then be the 10th Secretary of State in a row, going all the way back to the 40s, who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. An organization formed to bring about a socialistic one-world government. And there's a perfect example of why there is a need for a John Birch Society. Factor that into your consciousness, and then you begin to understand, first of all, why we exist, secondly, what we're trying to do, and third, how important all of this information is.
And we're not only fighting commission on the part of the sources where you and I depend upon for our information. We're trying to fight omission as well. The avoidance of explaining to the American people the crucial issues in many vital areas that confront us today. We've developed over the years a national field staff We have better than 50 men in the field today that help us organize chapters, recruit members, help our members institute educational programs in their local communities through the ingenuity and initiative of our members themselves. We have chapters in every state of the Union, every city of any size across this country. Our members are equipped now with the tools of the trade, so to speak, the means to impart this educational program to the people with whom they come in contact. We've got a concerted program, action program, as we outlined. It comes out regularly monthly in a monthly bulletin that the Society produces for its membership to give us some guidelines as how we can become more effective in our educational effort and manifesting that in our influence in government. These are the things that no other organization has achieved. There isn't another organization anywhere in the United States or around the world, for that matter, working in our ballpark that has anywhere near the equipment, the means, the steadfast principles, the chapters throughout the country, the activities that we have. We're all for single-interest conservative groups. We're all for conservative political action groups, but they have to depend upon a grassroots educational program to get their muscle. And largely they come out of the people that have come through the ranks of the John Birch Society to help these other single interest and political groups maintain themselves.
We're running very short on time, and I'd like to have a brief summary of the Society's position on three issues here. One is the national debt.
It's horrible.
The other is our defense posture in Latin America. And the third is our disarmament negotiations.
Well,
now, in view of the time limits, this will have to be very,
let me
short.
start off with the national debt. The national debt is absolutely mortgaging the future for Americans today. I have children now of marriageable age. Them purchasing a home, it's very, very difficult for them to even consider it at the economic level that they are and I am. Whereas in my circumstances 25 years ago, it was the American dream. That's all being destroyed. You know, the national debt, of course, is leading to high interest rates. It is fostering inflation, which is the increase in the money supply, and it's absolutely wrong. The government of the United States should not spend in deficit.
It's very simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Chuck, what about our position in Latin America?
Well, in Latin America, I think it's becoming obvious to most people, and certainly they admit it, and even our own government admits it, that there's a communist revolution afoot in the Central American states. We were the principal force that allowed Nicaragua to be turned over to a communist group, the Sandinistas. We know, for instance, that communist revolution coming up the Central American states is not only equipped and financed, but trained by the Soviet Union, through Cuba, through Libya, and a variety of other places, to ultimately create the revolutionary climate in those countries where it hasn't become hot yet, and reach the southern border as a threat to the United States of America. We think with the communist movement and revolution at our borders, we ought to take a firm, hard stand against its continued
what does that mean? How firm and how hard?
Anybody who means to do anything about communist subversion in Latin America, Central America, and doesn't start at Cuba is a faker. Because it's coming from Cuba. Now, how do you do that? You stop helping the Soviet Union. They send $5 million a day to Cuba. And we help the Soviet Union. So we're right back to that very same thing. The aid and trade issue not only causes us problems because they now have a nuclear threat, it causes us problems because we have a Central American threat. And we have a threat in Afghanistan, and we have a threat someplace else. If the American people would please grab a hold of this issue and understand that if we could stop helping communism, communism would stop functioning.
Then finally, what about our disarmament negotiations?
Anybody who makes an agreement with a communist is absolutely bound to get a broken agreement to the communist advantage. There is nothing to be gained from sitting down across a table with people who've demonstrated over and over and over again that they break every agreement that they've ever made to their advantage.
Just as an example in SALT 1 and 2, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, Mr. Schultz knows, Mr. Kissinger knew, that the Soviets had broken SALT 1 at least 27 times.
Sure, and
So
continue.
why don't we go back to them and plead with them to come and continue the disarmament of the free world?
Let me make our commercial again.
I just say we have to close
All
here,
right.
so I think it's a good idea to tell our listeners where to get more
A
information.
$2 packet, the John Birch Society, Belmont, Massachusetts, 02178. We'll send information about the things we've discussed, plus a lot more. You'll be very glad you had it, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, our topic has been the John Birch Society, and we've been talking to official spokesmen from the John Birch Society, Mr. Jack McManus, Mr. Chuck Armour, and we hope that those of you who are interested in more information will send in to the Society, Belmont, Massachusetts, 02178. In the meantime, I'm Ed Griffin. Thanks for watching.